Hello friends, welcome to another video. In this series we have decided to call the Bridgerton Chronicles. Today I bring you the story of Francesca Bridgerton, the sixth sister in the family. Let's get started. In the books, Francesca is described as a blue-eyed, brown-haired woman. Michael, meanwhile, is described as a tall, muscular man with silver eyes and black hair. He also stands out as the most attractive in society, even above the Bridgerton brothers. Michael Sterling was considered a womanizer. He had certainly been with all sorts of women, had indulged them in 1,000 different ways and enjoyed it, but he had never committed his heart to any of them. But that day, the day he met Francesca Bridgerton, he knew what many were talking about, and there was no doubt in his mind that he had fallen in love. However, ironically enough, that love was impossible, as Francesca was to be married 36 hours later to John Sterling, her cousin. Logically, he would do nothing about it. Although Michael had seduced countless women, he would never try it with Francesca. She was his cousin's wife, the one who had been like a brother to him all his life. Instead, he had decided to disguise his feelings for Francesca as much as possible, pretending to be more joyful and enthusiastic than he really was, and picking up whores whenever he had the chance in order to maintain an image of a ladies' man in front of the couple, and so far it had worked for him. John was the Earl of Kilmartin in Scotland, so they enjoyed all kinds of wealth and property. Logically, this marriage had given Francesca the title of Countess. Michael, on the other hand, had no title and no property, other than a small piece of land given to him by his cousin after he returned from the army so that he would feel he was useful in some way. Francesca was oblivious to his feelings, so oblivious that she constantly urged him to find a wife, even proposing, on one occasion, that he meet her sister Eloise, who was still single at the time. The events of this story begin one ordinary day at one of the Kilmartin properties. Francesca and John, talking about how they would celebrate their second wedding anniversary, which would be very soon, were very much in love and constantly expressed their love for each other. It had been very rainy days in the area, so once out in the field, Francesca asked her husband to accompany her to get some fresh air. But since John had an important meeting with other counts and had suffered from a rare headache during the day, Michael was the one who accompanied her. Francesca considered Michael a good friend, even her confidant. She loved and cared for him sincerely. That was odd because she didn't feel very comfortable around men. Although she had grown up with 4 brothers and 3 sisters, she felt different. While the other Bridgertons were outgoing, she was more reserved. She used to make wry and witty remarks to her siblings, but usually she tended to be the quiet one. And though she loved her family and the chaos it represented, John had been an escape from it for her. They were perfect for each other, and she had known it from the first moment he had spoken to her. After finishing the walk, they both returned home. John's valet told Francesca that her husband wouldn't wake up no matter how many times she knocked on the door, so she decided to go upstairs herself to wake him up. But when she entered the room, she found only his lifeless body lying on the bed. He had died in his sleep. That no doubt meant that the title of Earl would pass to Michael, since neither of them had had siblings. Unless Francesca was pregnant. And that Michael had to ask himself, since the Board of Earls needed to know, in order to know what to do with his family's earldom. He did not want to do so, for it was only a day since Franny, as he used to call her, had been widowed. But it was not necessary. She herself confirmed her pregnancy to him. After this, Michael changed. He became more distant, and Francesca got the impression that she had lost not only John, but also Michael, and that made her feel deeply sad. Losing her husband was an indescribable pain, which not even her mother, who had also been widowed at a fairly young age, could have explained to her. Michael, for his part, had thought that after John's death, his feelings for Francesca would disappear, but they hadn't. He loved her, he still loved her, even more than before, and that made him feel guilty. Guilty because now everything that had belonged to John would be his title, his property, his life. he could not take from Francesca. For this reason, he had decided to keep his distance, for he could not bear to have her near him. A few weeks after John's death, Michael was in his office when he received the news that Francesca had lost the baby. He rushed home as fast as he could, but once he was there, he wasn't able to see her, even when her mother told him she had asked to see him, so he just ran away. As the days passed, Michael officially became the Earl of Kilmartin. He continued to keep his distance from Francesca, as he believed it was the right thing to do, until one day she herself appeared in his chambers. She complained to him that he had not been there for her when she needed him most, and that she did not understand why he had left her alone at that time, when she was the one person he needed most. He replied that he didn't know what to do about it, or how he could be of any use to her. She had suffered a miscarriage, something a man could not understand. He told her that the best thing to do was to talk to a woman, her mother or her sisters, and she replied that she didn't want anyone else but him, and that, in a way, that baby would be his too. He told her that he couldn't ask her to be John, that the baby wasn't his, and after that argument, he ran away again, but this time to India. 4 years later, in March 1824, Francesca had a new discovery, which she herself had refused to accept for months. She wanted to have a child. Loneliness was not a bad thing for her. Indeed, after John's death, she had grown accustomed to it and even found it comforting on many occasions. But when her nephews came to visit her or she returned to her family home seasonally, she could not help but feel a deep desire to be a mother. She was still the Countess of Kilmartin, for Michael had not married, so she retained the obligations which the title entailed, and so she was never bored, but she could not help feeling that something was missing, something small in hers. It had been hard for him to admit it because, even though it had been 4 years since John's death, he felt that to have a child, not his, would be disloyal on his part, plus it would mean remarrying in the first place. But he had made up his mind he would enter the marriage market again. So he packed his things and left for London a month in advance, so that he would have time to prepare for the social season that year. Michael, for his part, had already made up his mind to return to London. The escape had given him the peace he needed, and being away from Francesca had made things much easier, but he couldn't run away forever. He knew that he would see her again, and that he would surrender to her blue eyes, because in the end, he would never stop loving her. But he had decided to return a month in advance, hoping that she was still in Scotland and to delay their meeting as long as possible. But they both decided to settle down at the Kilmartin estate in London on the same night, so it was inevitable that they would meet in the middle of the night. Francesca noticed immediately that Michael had changed. Not only physically, being outrageously tanned from the Indian sun, and his dark shock of hair now had a couple of gray locks, but also in his attitude. Before, he had seemed more confident, more relaxed and fun-loving. Now, on the other hand, he seemed more tense. Francesca couldn't help but complain to him for leaving and abandoning her either. He had sent her letters, but after sending the third one without getting any response from her, he had given up. Michael told Francesca that he hadn't changed at all, but that wasn't true. After so long now, he felt she was a free woman and available. The two chatted for a while and apologized to each other. Francesca decided it would be wise to go to her mother's house, to avoid gossip, and so she did, but not before leaving a note for Michael, inviting him to visit her for a chat. That afternoon they went for a walk and chatted about the fact that Michael's reputation as a womanizer had not changed in the eyes of society, that even the women kept asking Francesca about his return, and that the boy was known for his seductive abilities that charmed all women, from single women to widows like Violet, who fell in love with him. That conversation led to another subject, and Francesca asked him if now that he was back, he intended to take up his position as the Earl of Kilmartin, which she had been taking over since his retirement. He did not know how to answer, so she insisted that now that he had a title, he should marry. This was not the first time this conversation had come up. Indeed, Francesca had always insisted on finding him a wife, but this time, the tone in which she mentioned it sounded somewhat different, as if she wanted to prod him on the subject. They were walking some more around a lake that used to be full of children, and it was at that moment, as Francesca stared at a stroller, that she confessed to Michael that she wanted to have a baby. This left Michael speechless, as having a child meant she would remarry, and he wasn't sure he could bear it. Not again. She, in turn, dreaded remarriage. She was sure she would not find someone to love as she had loved John once, so she would only settle for someone who loved and treated her well. But at the same time, she feared she would marry and not be able to bear a child, since it had taken her 2 years with John, and even then she had lost him. Michael tried to console her by telling her that actually getting married and not being able to have children was more common than it seemed, and it was at that moment, after turning to look at him and meeting his gaze face to face, that Francesca began to feel something different, and she began to see him as someone else, no longer as John's friend or cousin, but as Michael, as a man. Terrified, she fled the place under the pretext that she had an appointment with the dressmaker, although she didn't. However, she decided to take advantage of the occasion and change her wardrobe. If she was going to enter the marriage market, she had to change her wardrobe and leave the mourning colors behind. Enthusiastically, Violet offered to accompany her. As they shopped, Francesca asked her mother why she did not remarry. She replied that she didn't marry because she never sought to. She had 8 children, was older, and never saw the need to look for anyone else. That night, the two women found themselves waiting for Michael to arrive to join them for dinner, as Violet had made a formal invitation that evening, but he did not show up. This was quite strange for him, so Francesca decided to go and look for him, and found a Michael lying in bed, under sheets burning with fever. He had malaria and had been hiding it. Francesca decided to stay and look after him that night, and for the next 7 nights as well, and helped him hide the disease, as Michael did not want to attract the attention of the London doctors, who would treat him like a laboratory mouse, since the disease was rare in that city. This, however, began to raise Violet's suspicions, not that Michael was ill, but that he and Francesca were secretly having an affair. So she set out to check on the man herself. Desperate that her mother wouldn't discover something she didn't understand, Francesca rushed to meet Michael. He didn't understand what the fuss was about, of course. She couldn't imagine being with him, but he, nevertheless, wouldn't stop doing it. He tried to make fun of the situation by telling her that, in reality, many other women would fight over the fact that others thought they were with him. And contrary to what he would have expected, Francesca's reaction was different, as if something in her had changed, as if she no longer felt comfortable with his reputation as a libertine. Fortunately, Francesca's brother Colin arrived from his long trip to Europe, and Violet was unable to go to the Sterling house. However, Francesca kept convincing herself that the idea of them having an affair was absurd and far-fetched. Michael's mother and John's mother arrived soon after, so Violet's worries about her daughter's reputation disappeared. Michael's mother, Helen, came with the firm intention of getting her son married, so she practically forced him to attend Violet's birthday party, which he was going to do anyway, as he thought himself incapable of refusing an invitation from the Viscountess. A few days later, Francesca was wandering around her mother's party, irritated by the fact that she kept being questioned about the whereabouts of the handsome and debauched Earl of Kilmartin, better known as Michael, who seemed to be the most eligible bachelor of the season. Francesca had decided to attend the party in her new blue dress, thus subtly announcing her re-entry into the marriage market. Kate, Sophie, and Eloise, who were also at the party, noticed it immediately, as well as Michael's presence once he set foot in the room. The 3 women seemed to be drooling over him, as well as all the other ladies present at the party, single or otherwise. Michael was surrounded by dozens of them and seemed quite pleased with his situation, though in reality, he was not. In fact, he was pretending, trying to distract Francesca's attention, so that she would think he was still his usual libertine self. When he managed to get rid of his group of desperate admirers, bachelorettes, Michael approached her and they had a brief conversation in which Francesca pressured him to put his philandering life aside. He should get married and stay away from single women, especially young girls whom he could disgrace. Michael was not the same libertine he used to be, even if he appeared to be. and even if he was, he would be incapable of dishonoring any young woman. So he replied coldly that he would follow her orders and find someone to marry. Francesca didn't understand why it bothered her so much, nor did she know why she suddenly felt guilty. She spent the rest of the night counting all of Michael's conquests, as he had told her he would do when they had argued a few minutes before. And he seemed to be flirting with every woman who came his way, just to please her so she could keep telling, as if he wanted to annoy her. Clearly, he was upset, even if he pretended he wasn't, and this was his way of getting even. If society's rules changed, he would find his house full of flowers the next day, all sent to Michael from desperate women. Ironically, his nightmare come true. When she woke up the next morning, she found her house full of flowers of all kinds and was surprised to learn that they were actually for her. Michael couldn't help but be annoyed by the scenario, which made her tease him by asking if he was jealous, but he instantly retracted it, clarifying that he didn't mean he was jealous of her, but that she had more suitors than he did. "A man would have to be a complete fool not to want to marry you," he said quietly, leaving her speechless, and continued, "I would never envy you this. You must be happy." After that conversation, Michael decided to go to a bar for a drink. There, he was approached by a couple of Francesca's suitors, who asked if he was the one they should ask for her hand, and if, like Francesca's older brother Anthony, he would also offer a dowry, being the current Earl of Kilmartin. But what infuriated Michael were the disparaging remarks made by the pair of men about Francesca's virginity and how she was more experienced than a single girl, having been married before. Michael couldn't take it, and although he had no desire to come to blows with the men, he simply threatened them and forbade them to speak of her again, all the while holding one of them by the throat. What Michael didn't know was that Colin Bridgerton was watching him in the shadows, and once the scene was over, he invited him in for a drink. Colin was also known in society as a libertine, and he was also quite shrewd, so Michael thought that if anyone could sense the feelings he had for Francesca, it was him. And he was not far wrong, for once they were seated, and with a drink in the hand of each, Colin asked him why he did not marry his sister. This, of course, took Michael unawares, and he replied that he simply could not, because she had been his cousin's wife. Colin replied that there was no law against it, and that perhaps the reason he would not consider the idea was because he did not want to marry her. Michael was about to reply that he was wrong because he really did want to marry Francesca. He wanted to with all his might, but he couldn't do it. For him, marrying the girl meant accepting that he had stolen John's life, that he had taken everything that had been his, and that somehow they would think that he had wished her dead. Of course, Michael had never dared to. He could love Francesca from the first moment he saw her, when she was already engaged to John, but he had resigned himself, from that moment, to the fact that he would lead a life without her, because above all, he loved his cousin and respected him. And even then, years after her death, he felt that marrying her would be like betraying him. Judging by the looks Colin was giving her, she was aware of his feelings for her, but she simply decided not to press any further, so she decided to leave. But before she did, she said to him, "Think about what I told you," and without further ado, she left. The idea of marrying Francesca had never crossed his mind, not until that moment, and now that he thought about it, he was dying to make her his wife, even if he couldn't. At the same time, the thought of Colin knowing how he felt about her was driving him crazy. He had been careful enough that no one had even suspected for the past 6 years that he loved her, and he had hidden it successfully, until that moment. Could Colin tell Francesca? A week later, he found himself watching her from afar at a dance, surrounded by some of her suitors. Michael had noticed her presence from the moment he set foot in the room. For some reason, he had perfected the skill of always being aware of her presence. But when he went out to dance with his mother and had to turn his back on her for a few seconds, he lost sight of her. As soon as the dance was over, he went in search of her, discovering that she had, in fact, slipped out into the garden with a gentleman. She was laughing and flirting, or so it seemed until he heard her deny it, as if she were being forced to do something she didn't want to. It had not occurred to Francesca that Sir Geoffrey might make a pass at her. From the beginning, he had behaved in a kindly manner, flattering her and making her laugh, until, in the darkness of the garden, he had cornered her against a tree and planted a kiss against her will. Francesca had been about to drive her knee into the man's groin when he disappeared. Seconds later, she would notice that Sir Geoffrey had not magically vanished, and that, in fact, he was receiving a good couple of blows from Michael. He had a grim look on his face and seemed ready to murder the man on the spot if Francesca asked him to, but he didn't. But this fierce behavior had frightened her. She decided to leave the dance after that, but not before asking him how he had known she was in the garden. Michael did not answer, so she insisted this time, changing the question. "Were you watching me?" "I'm always watching you," he answered sadly. Arriving at the Kilmartin house, Francesca could not help torturing herself with her thoughts about what had happened minutes before. Michael had behaved like a gentleman, but at the same time, he gave the impression that he had defended her out of mere commitment, as if it were an obligation, so she had told herself that she would leave him alone. She would not bother him anymore or talk to him. She would limit herself to be aware of his presence in the house, and of course to stick her ear to the door of his room every time he arrived. That same night, when he returned, Francesca did what she never thought she would do. She came out of her room at the precise moment she knew he was passing in front of her and stood in front of him. Michael looked handsome, with his tie hanging down the side of his neck and a couple of tousled black locks on his forehead. She had always been aware of his beauty, but had never admired it until then. He seemed surprised to see her, and at the same time tired, as if he didn't feel like talking. Francesca, however, was ready for a conversation. She asked him why he was upset with her. He was still reluctant to discuss, so she was forced to go into his room, forcing him to continue the conversation. She was pushing him to his limit. First Colin, then Sir Geoffrey, now Francesca. At any moment he could explode, but Francesca seemed oblivious to what he was feeling, and contrary to what Michael wanted her to do, which was leave his room. She began to interrogate him, asking if he was upset that she wanted to remarry and complaining that he was so selfish as to expect her to mourn John for the rest of his life. He wore his hair loose and his sleeping clothes, and at that moment, seeing her inside his room, ready not to leave it, he could not contain himself and kissed her, and she did not oppose that kiss. On the contrary, she seemed to give herself to him until she felt him touch her breast. This intimate act that seemed to break down a barrier between them brought her out of her reverie. She fled from the place, and the next day fled to her mother's house, and then to Scotland. Michael, for his part, found himself torturing himself for having rushed into it. He had been trying all day to get that memory out of his head, his lips on hers, the heat of her body. But he couldn't. He even tried to distract his mind by going to a brothel, quite popular in the area. But he didn't find what he was looking for, so he ended up going for a drink. To her bad luck, she ran into Colin once again. He was already aware of his sister's absence and seemed to enjoy torturing him by asking him if he had decided whether he would marry her or not, and reminding him that in reality there was nothing stopping him, other than the excuses he made up for himself. She could say no, he replied. Colin didn't contradict him. In fact, he told her that it was quite likely that he would have to ask her more than once before she would agree. Irritated, Michael asked him how many times he had had to propose, and with a sly smile, Colin replied once and told him that in fact, he had become engaged that very afternoon to Penelope Fetherington. The identity of the bride surprised Michael, as it did everyone else for that matter. He had known Penelope, whom even Francesca had tried to poke through his eyes when she insisted on being his matchmaker, but she had not struck him as a very talkative woman, and Colin was quite the opposite, so they were a rather particular pair. Michael couldn't quite believe it. Colin Bridgerton, who had practically professed his intentions of not getting married, was engaged. This gave him the impetus he needed, and he took the news of the wedding as an excuse to go to Scotland, as someone had to break the news to Francesca. That same day, he left London, ready to ask for Francesca's hand. He spent the whole trip practicing what he would tell her, He had to convince her that a marriage between the two of them was the most convenient, just as he had convinced himself. But he knew that Francesca would not make it easy for him, so he had to use valid arguments for his proposal. He had never thought of the possibility of such a thing happening, but now, the idea of marrying her, of sharing the rest of his life at her side, of perhaps not having her love completely, but her appreciation, seemed quite palpable. He would marry Francesca Bridgerton and convince her of it. Michael announced Colin's recent engagement to her and almost immediately expressed his intentions to marry her. He explained to her that this would make things easier. She would not have to abandon her position as countess, and she would not even have to move house. Besides, by marrying him, she would be sure that she would marry a man who would always respect her, a certainty that she could not have with another man until she was married. And, of course, he would give her children, or at least he would try to. The idea of being in the same bed with him made Francesca blush completely, not because she hadn't imagined it, because, to be honest, she had, in fact. She had done nothing but try to get the image of the two of them together out of her mind during the last few days after the kiss. She couldn't believe what he was proposing. They couldn't get married. They were like family. Michael knew this was going to be her reaction, so understanding that he couldn't persuade her with reason, he understood that he was going to have to seduce her, and so he did. That night he took her, and she was openly into it, and of course, actively participated. And so it was that they had their first night together. The next day, the guilt was killing her. She had shared a bed with another man before, and that, of course, was John. But she had never experienced the pleasure Michael had given her the night before, and that made her feel guilty. She felt ashamed of what had happened and just wanted to run away. But she was aware that she could not go back to London, so she decided to go for a walk to get away from him for at least a few hours. To her bad luck, a storm took her by surprise, and she was forced to shelter from the rain until a few hours later, Michael came looking for her. On the way back to the house, the rain didn't stop, and the horse they were on started to limp, so they were forced to stay in a small cabin on his property that was on the road. There, Michael again reminded her of his proposal the night before, but she still refused to answer. He reminded her that she might be pregnant right now, so Francesca decided that as soon as she knew if she was, she would tell him if she would marry him or not. That night, they shared a bed again, but even after that second encounter, she still couldn't say yes. It seemed the most logical and convenient thing to do, especially considering the kind of intimacies they had shared not once but twice. But still, she could not convince herself to take the next step. She excused herself to Michael, saying that she didn't know if he could be a good husband for her, given his background and bad reputation as a libertine, although she knew perfectly well that these were just excuses, so she asked Michael to give her time to think, and that was just what he did. The next 2 days, he only received breakfast, lunch, and dinner from her. Not a flower, attention, or note. He was doing what she had asked him to do, but for some reason, it made her feel strange. So on that occasion, it was she herself who sought him out and discovered that now he had changed his method. He would no longer continue to seduce her, unless she wanted him to, but on the contrary, he was going to court her. But was that what she wanted? Actually, she wanted with all her might for him to continue seducing her, although this time he didn't have to try very hard for her to give in and fall into his arms. 3 more weeks went by, days in which Francesca still did not give a concrete answer to his proposal, even though he asked her twice, days in which they continued to share a bed. But now, it was no longer just about sex, but about the connection they had created when they talked all night long, cuddling, sharing memories of their childhoods and travels. Shortly thereafter, she got her period, discovering that she was not pregnant. After this, they had an argument. Michael had been pleasing her for so long without receiving an answer from her that he couldn't help but feel angry and used by her. He asked her one more time, and since she didn't know how to answer him, he asked her to leave the house. "If you can't be with me, if you can't give yourself to me all of yourself, I'd rather you left," he told her, and she asked him why. That seemed like an ironic question to Michael, who, for the first time, confessed to her that he had always loved her. From the first time he saw her, when she married John, and even while she was in India. Francesca was stunned after that confession and needed a few hours to process what she had just heard. Finally, after so many years, he had been able to say it out loud. He no longer had anything to hide. She knew now. He had always loved her. Hours later, Francesca returned, and finally, she gave him an answer. She would marry him. Michael was happy, of course, and so was she. But now she was worried about how she would tell her family, and especially Janet, John's mother. She was sitting at her desk, trying to write something convincing when she received a letter from her mother. Colin and Penelope had decided to move up the wedding, and Eloise was getting married in 3 days. As much as she wanted to, she would not make it to the wedding. And it bothered her that no one had given her advance notice of these events. It was as if her family had forgotten about her, so Michael suggested they do the same. "Let's get married today," he said, and so they did. That day, they also had their wedding night, and although it was not the first time they had been together, it had been different. They were now husband and wife, and rather than having sex as a pair of lovers, they had made love. 2 weeks later, Michael became ill again. It had been 2 months since he had suffered his last bout of malaria, and that was worrying, as they were not usually so frequent. And when they were, it did not bode well. He did not want to worry Francesca, so he insisted that it was just a cold. But when the fever began to rise, higher and higher, he could no longer hide it. He was likely to die. There was no other explanation. Francesca was devastated. Losing a husband had brought her almost to death, and she wasn't sure she could resist him one more time, or even wanted to. It was at that moment that she realized that she loved him, not as one loves a friend, which she used to think, but as one loves a husband, with the same intensity with which she loved John, and now she would lose him. Fortunately for her, Michael was right. It was not malaria that was causing her fever, as it did not follow the same patterns of the disease that he already knew very well. Unable to help herself, she went running to John's grave. She had to talk to him and tell him what had happened, and more importantly, she had to tell him that she loved Michael, because she was beginning to believe that would definitely make him happy. And as she was talking to her late husband, sitting in front of his grave, Michael appeared behind her back. He had heard everything, but still, she repeated it to him. She told him that she loved him more than anyone else, and repeated it as many times as she felt necessary, and after melting into an emotional embrace, they returned home together. Sometime later, Michael received a letter from Janet, John's mother. She confessed that the union had been a surprise to her, but that didn't mean she didn't agree. It was difficult for her, of course, because she was still grieving the loss of her son, but it made her happy that they loved each other and were together, and they certainly had her blessing. Finally, she ended the letter by saying, "Thank you, Michael, for allowing my son to love her first." Epilogue 2. Michael and Francesca had been married for 3 years, and she still couldn't have a baby. She anxiously counted the days when she would be fertile, but menstruation always ended up appearing. She pretended it didn't affect her, but Michael noticed her sadness and always tried to comfort her. She didn't want to be ungrateful and repeated to herself that she should be happy for everything she had, especially for Michael, who loved her as much as she loved him. But at night, when she felt an emptiness, when Michael slept and she felt completely alone, she couldn't help crying. Michael had also begun to feel the same way. At first, he had to confess that all he wanted was to make her happy, and if having a baby would do that, then that was what he wanted too. But for a while now, he had found himself longing for a child of his own, especially when they visited Francesca's siblings and he had the opportunity to share with his nieces and nephews. A year later, they traveled to London for the christening of Hyacinth's daughter, Isabella. There, her mother told her that Eloise was pregnant, as was Lucy, her brother Gregory's wife, who was expecting their second child, even though they had only been married less than 2 years. Francesca couldn't help but notice how her mother pitied her for her situation. and that bothered her. Although she understood that it wasn't her fault, Violet couldn't help but worry about her, and it was totally normal. That day, they had a mother-daughter talk. There had been a pact of silence regarding the subject, but at that moment, Francesca decided to talk and cry and let her mother comfort her. Michael arrived a few days later. They had planned to stay until 2 days after the christening, but they enjoyed being with their nephews so much that they had extended their stay for 3 weeks. In addition, Francesca had begun to feel calmer, more serene. One of those nights, as they were sharing a bed, they noticed that she should be in her days, although she wasn't bleeding, which meant she might be pregnant. Michael asked her if she wanted to announce it to her family, but she said no, but not because she thought the pregnancy might not go to term, as had happened with the previous one. In fact, for some reason, she was sure she would have this baby. However, she wanted to keep it for herself, for them. A year later, he returned to England to visit his family, surprising Violet with an unexpected grandchild. It was a baby just 3 months old, whom they had named John. Violet noticed immediately that he was identical to Francesca. That day, they introduced the baby to his family, and his grandmother wouldn't let him go for a second, so Michael took advantage of the time to find him a baby sister. 9 months later, they welcomed Janet Helen Sterling, who was identical to her father. What do you think about Francesca and Michael's story? What other character would you like us to talk about in the channel? Let me know in the comments.